Hello and welcome to our new lecture of Sons and Lovers. This lecture is going to discuss Paul launches into life and death in the family. Without further ado, let's get started. Mr. Morel is injured at work when a piece of rock falls on his leg. When Mrs. Morel gets the news, she is very flustered. While she is preparing to go to the hospital to see him, Paul calms her down and gives her some tea, and she leaves for the hospital. When she returns, she tells the children that their father's leg is injured rather badly. Mrs. Morel feels somewhat guilty because she no longer loves her husband. While she is sorry for his pain and his injury, she still feels an emotional emptiness. True to his nature, Morel does cover, and the family is very happy and peaceful while he is still in the hospital, almost to the point of regretting that he will soon return. Paul applies to several jobs and he was frustrated at the beginning, but later he is summoned to call on Thomas Jordan, a manufacturer of surgical appliances, and his mother is overjoyed. Paul and Mrs. Morel travel to Nottingham one Tuesday morning to respond to the invitation. Paul suffers the whole way there, reading the interview and the necessity of being scrutinized by strangers. Paul is hired as junior spiral clerk. After the interview, Paul and his mother have dinner in an eating house where it turns out that the food is more expensive than they realized. They ordered the cheapest dish possible. After dinner, they wander around the town. Paul is happy with his mother. We can see the way the narrative perspective has shifted from that of Mrs. Morel to that of Paul through the way Mrs. Morel's trip to the hospital is narrated. The narrator describes Mrs. Morel leaving for the hospital, and then he describes her returning. The events that happened outside of the house seems to be outside the narrative field of vision. However, this is not the case later in this chapter when Paul goes to Nottingham to work. This suggests that Paul has become the primary focus of the narrative. This chapter contains further examples of the identification between Paul and Mrs. Morel. Paul comforts her and talks to her every day. It seems as if their identification is extended to the point that they are sharing the same life, and this is a motive that will continue through the rest of the novel. Meanwhile, William is becoming a gentleman in London and is beginning to see a girl, whom he calls Gypsy. He asks her for a photograph to send to his mother, and when the photo comes, it shows her with bare shoulders. Mrs. Morel comments to William that she does not think the photo is appropriate, and the girl sends another one in which she is wearing an evening gown. Mrs. Morel is still not impressed. We also see further evidence of Mrs. Morel's disappointment in William, her favorite in this chapter. She has been previously disappointed in William when he takes up dancing, and here she is disappointed that he does not send them money. She also disapproves of the girl he is seeing and the pictures that she sends. The next Monday morning, Paul goes off to work on the train. He arrives at the factory and is introduced to his boss, Pappleworth. Pappleworth shows him how to fetch and copy letters, to write out orders and invoices, and to make up parcels for shipping. He also introduces him to some of the other people who work in the factory, and Paul gets along best with the women, like Polly, the overseer of the sewing crew, and the hunchback Fanny, who works in the finishing off room. He becomes friends with many of the women and grows to like this job at Jordan's. Chapter 6, Death in the Family. This chapter begins with a description of Arthur and tells how, as he grows older, he comes to dislike his father. All of the children follow this same trend until they all hate him. Arthur wins a scholarship to the school in Nottingham, and his mother decided to let him live in town with one of her sisters because of his aggressive relationship with his father. Annie is a teacher in the board school, and Mrs. Morel clings to Paul. William becomes engaged to the girl he has been seeing and decided to bring her home at Christmas. She comes home with him and puts on airs of high station, treating Annie like a servant. William begins to be annoyed with the way that she acts much grander than his family. Paul has Monday afternoon off from work, and one Monday his mother tells him that they have been invited to see Mr. Livers on his new farm. They decided to go that afternoon. They have a nice walk through the countryside on the way there, and then are welcomed and given a tour of the farm when they arrive. The Livers boys show Paul how to make the chicken eat out of his hand, and they tease their sister Miriam because she is afraid to try. Paul later finds her shyly reaching her hand toward the chicken and helps her to let it eat out of her hand. The next time William brings his fiancée home, she once again annoys him and the rest of his family with her attitude towards his sister. He begins to ridicule her in front of others and discuss with his mother that he no longer really wants to marry her, but he feels that he has gone on too long to break it off now. He comes home again alone the first weekend in October, and his mother noticed that he has not been well. The Tuesday morning after this return, Mrs. Morel gets a telegram saying that he is ill. She takes the train to London, arrives at William's lodging, and stays with him until he dies late that night. She sends a telegram for Morel to come to London, and when it arrives, Paul has to go to the mine to fetch his father. Morel goes to London, and Mr. and Mrs. Morel return on Saturday night. After William's death, Mrs. Morel becomes shut off until one day Paul falls ill with pneumonia. She almost loses him as well, but he somehow pulls through, and Mrs. Morel's life now rooted itself in Paul. The title of the chapter foreshadows what will happen in the end of the chapter. However, the reader wonders throughout the chapter which member of the family will die. Since the first sentence of the chapter begins with Arthur, the reader might begin by suspecting that Arthur will die. It is not until William alludes to his death by saying that his fiancée would forget about him 3 months after he died that we begin to suspect that William will die. He makes many allusions to his death, so that by the time his mother gets the telegram from London that he is ill, the reader is hardly surprised. Here we are now with the important quotations. The first quotation says, "For a photograph to send to his mother, the photo came a handsome brunette taken in profile, smirking slightly, and it might be quite naked." And this quotation is already explained within the context of this lecture. The second quotation says, "See, it doesn't hurt," he said, and putting only 2 corns in his paw. He let the hen peck, peck, peck his bare hand. "It only makes you laugh," he said. And this quotation is said by Paul to Miriam when he was trying to motivate her to feed the chicken. And this represents, of course, the beginning of the relation. This is the end of our 4th lecture, and I hope to see you in the next one.